Trying to find my way, 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 trying to find my way. I'm trying, change me.
My faith is in God alone, beyond a reasonable doubt. This brainstorm pouring rain on your season of drought. Just trying to lay a couple seeds in the mouth. Thanks for listening. You ever get the feeling you was missing?
What up, y'all? It's your hometown hero, Scott Lane, the Black Bruce Wayne, a.k.a. the real Adam Coleman. So, you riding with Tru-ID. And just getting back in town, man, from Greensboro, North Carolina. I was down there with the Mentionables Network, which is a group of apologists that I'm affiliated with from all different parts of the country. And, this was our first annual Mentionables Conference, man. Like I said, down there in Greensboro, North Carolina. So definitely want to give a shout out to the Mentionables team. And so, y'all know how I do, man. When I go out of town, if I'm able to get the audio for my presentation, I like to, bring it back and just kind of keep y'all up to date as to what I'm out there doing, man. So I wanted to share the audio from my presentation entitled "The Impact of the Church on Human History." So I covered a lot of different things here, man, and hopefully y'all enjoy, y'all. Here it is.
All right. Well, hello, Greensboro. Y'all doing all right? Woo! You made it to the end. That's a good thing. Well, I mean, we've already, met just about everybody here. I'm Adam Coleman, the host of the Tru-ID Podcast. And shameless plug already. If you haven't, checked out my show, check it out. Tru-IDpodcast.com. I just want to say thank you to the pastors and to the leadership of this church for having us out here. It's been a blast, and hopefully we'll end out well. Of course, you want to save the best for last. Unfortunately, the best couldn't make it here today, so you're going to be stuck in there for the next 45 minutes. But I'll do what I can. I'll tell you what. We're talking about the impact of Christianity on church history, right? At the outset, I want to say we've got a big task ahead of us in a little bit of time, so I want to jump right into it. Just looking at the scriptures, right? What kind of impact would we expect for the church to have in human history, right? When you look at the biblical narrative, broadly speaking, you see a picture of brokenness and beauty. There's a balance between the two, right? I mean, just think about in the Old Testament, the relationship between God and Israel. In 1 minute, Israel is, leaving the promised land. It's like, woo, God is everything. And then next minute they're doing the whole golden calf thing, right? And, then when they get into the promised land, I mean, God brings them in through all these different trials and tribulations. And you roll over a couple chapters and they've got, Baal worship going on. Elijah has to set them straight. I mean, there's this back and forth between righteousness and rebellion in the Old Testament, right? Even in the New Testament, right? The Apostle Paul, he talks about how all is sin and fallen short of the glory of God. And, not only that, in Romans chapter 7, he describes the war between the flesh and the spirit. He says, the things that I do not want to do, those things I do. And the things I'm supposed to do, that's what I don't do, right? Having grasped this fragile nature of our resolve to do the right things, it's no wonder that later in that letter to the Romans, Paul admonishes the believers to not think more highly of themselves than they ought to think, right? A lot more can be said about that right there, but in essence, what I'm trying to get at is this. Biblically speaking, what you have is a holy and perfect God drawing imperfect people to himself, right? Imperfection is a part of the story of grace, if you will. Just take a quick glance over to Hebrews 11:1. You don't necessarily have to turn it. Just kind of, well, if you got a Bible, go for it. I'm a child of a preacher, so I can't help it. I know it's an apologist conference, but we can talk about the Bible too, right? I think it's all right. In Hebrews chapter 11, if you just kind of take an overview of it, you find this list of men who, by faith, did great things and saw God perform great miracles in their lives. And it's noteworthy that not one of them was perfect, right? The chapter starts out, it's talking about the framing of the world, and it quickly moves to the Cain and Abel narrative. You talk about Abraham, who was doubting and disobedient. He had a child with Hannah, trying to force the hand of God, so to speak, to bring about the promises that God made. You got Rahab the prostitute mixed in there, and then David, who we talked about a little bit earlier. I mean, Lord knows, just think about just David alone, the whole Bathsheba situation. You know, he sleeps with somebody's wife, and that's adultery. He sends a guy out to get killed, that's murder, and then he lies about it. You know, so you got adultery, murder, and lying all in that one area. And that's like the three worst sins you can commit. He just knocked them out all in one fell swoop. And yet, we find David playing such a central role in God's plan of salvation for mankind. I mean, the Messiah, the very Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world, comes through David's lineage, right? Taking all that into account, the old saying kind of comes to mind that God draws straight lines with crooked sticks. That's what he does. That's what he does. When we look at Scripture and then turn our eyes to church history, we should expect to see just that. God doing what he always does, drawing straight lines with crooked sticks. I think that all too often, even as apologists, if we're being honest, you know, it would be nice if we could look back at church history and kind of uphold like some sense of maybe premature Christian triumphalism, as if we've done it all right. You know, there's no blemishes in our history, but that's not the case, is it? And that's not Bible, is it? That's not Bible. It is true that during certain periods of history, some of the loudest and most visible parts of the church found itself on the wrong side of right. And, you know, those who oppose or are hesitant about the gospel will often, you know, throw that in our faces, ammunition against the gospel of Christ. They bring up things like slavery, Salem witch trials, Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades. And I think that rather than being dismissive, we need to have biblical, logical, and honest responses to these types of things. Right? Now, we won't be able to get into all that for this session, so I guess maybe you'll just have to invite me back and dig in further. I might leave like a cliffhanger at the end, like they did in the Avengers. Kind of get itching to bring me back, you know.
No spoilers.
No spoilers. It's like people watching and they're like, doggone it. You know? But here's what I want to do. I want to go over the highlights of the church and look at ways in which God used that crooked stick to draw some straight lines and ways that impacted the world. All right? There are aspects of the biblical worldview that seem to me to have provided fertile ground for the church to bear fruit that we partake of even now, in some ways take for granted. Now, obviously, we can't cover over 2,000 years of church history in about 40 minutes. But what we'll do is lightly touch on about 7 points in which we'll explore Christians taking the biblical worldview and impacting the world around them. You know, so try to wet your whistle a little bit if a name or event kind of sticks out. Maybe go back and research it and kind of glean from that. All right. Number one. Now, I'm supposed to be doing slides. I think hopefully this is the first one. It's like the slide sign, right? There we go. Okay, cool. Just want to make sure. Okay. So if you guys see me doing the peace sign over and over again, I'm not leaving yet. It's just that's the slide sign for at least the next 30, 45 minutes. Okay, so let's get into it. Number one, the church played a pivotal role in the development of the Western world's intellectual heritage. Okay? Again, I want to bring up the book of Hebrews. As I mentioned a minute ago, in Hebrews 11, there's no doubt that one of the most famous and I think misunderstood verses in the Bible comes from Hebrews chapter 11, particularly right there at the beginning. Slide sign. Oh, there we go. All right. Hebrews chapter 11:1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Very misunderstood verse right there. So let's talk about faith. When you take it back to the biblical languages, right? The Greek and the Hebrew. In the Greek, you have the word pistis, as somebody mentioned earlier. In the Hebrew, you have the word amana, right? Now, when people use the word faith today, they're often referring to something along the lines of blind faith, like believing where there's no evidence, something along those lines. However, the Hebrew word amana and the Greek word pistis are words that are more along the lines of trusting. That's why in Hebrews chapter 11, that verse is followed by this history lesson where God just tracks through, Cain and Abel and Moses and different people who did things of faith. And then he brings it all the way up to the beginning of chapter 12 where he says, now, with this great cloud of witnesses, you stand, right? God is basically saying that according to what I've revealed about myself, according to what I've done in the past, you can have confidence in what I'm about to do, what I'm commanding you to do. That's what faith is really all about. It's not just this kind of, touchy-feely, we feel good about God sort of thing. Biblical faith, linguistically and contextually, when the writers use the word faith in the Bible, they're talking about having trust in someone or something for which you have good reason to do so. That's what they're really talking about there. I mean, just think about in the Gospel of John, the author says that we write these things that you may believe, right? Acts chapter 17, it talks about a group of people referred to as the Bereans who were preached to in terms of the gospel, and they didn't just accept it willy-nilly. They searched these things out to see if they were true. And it was considered to be a noble thing for them to do so, right? The Apostle Paul himself, he midway through his ministry, he kind of had some questions. Paul had some doubts. And so he went back to the brothers in Jerusalem to make sure that he was running the race correctly. And when he describes that account, going back to Peter and James and giving them the gospel to make sure he had his ducks in a row, he used the word hysteresis to describe the inquiry that he made about the gospel. The word hysteresis means to go check things out for oneself. Right? Now, what am I getting at here? Christianity is not a dumb man's religion. And I think that it's mischaracterized such popularly. But historically, it's not a dumb man's religion. It's not a religion founded on blind faith. Going back to the church's very beginnings, we see Christianity is about actively engaging evidence and claims such that one has good grounds to hold to what he affirms to be true. That's the nature of the earliest era of Christianity. It's not just a bunch of people accepting stuff because it feels good. There was evidence and they checked these things out. Now, hold on to that for just 1 second. I want to enter in another point here, okay? We also have to remember that Christianity didn't emerge onto the first century scene out of nowhere, into like some vacuum space where you just have these people with blank slates in terms of their beliefs, right? At the church's inception, Christianity was a profoundly Jewish belief system. It was a profoundly Jewish sect, right? And by that time, the Jews had for centuries been relatively stalwart in their adherence to Yahweh and the Torah, even in the face of thoroughly polytheistic society and pressure from philosophers during those times. Jewish thinkers like Philo of Alexandria were active in upholding the Jewish faith by demonstrating how it stood up to philosophical and theological scrutiny. And so the church emerges out of Judaism and steps onto the scene where it must compete and defend itself in this polytheistic world that it found in the first century. Now, with these two prongs in place, if you will, of Christianity being a matter of evidence and early followers of Christ engaging these claims such that they have good reason to affirm Christianity, and alongside that, the fact that the church is birthed into a context in which it must defend itself against these polytheistic and philosophical detractors, I think it's easy to see how, from the beginning, Christianity did not emerge as a brain-dead endeavor. Now, with that in mind, from the historical record, we see that the church wasted little time before inserting itself into the intellectual arena of the Roman Empire. Indeed, one of the most renowned centers of learning in ancient Rome was the coastal city of Alexandria, Egypt. And it is in Alexandria, Egypt, that the first Christian seminary school was founded in about the 2nd century. The catechetical school of Alexandria gave birth to some of the earliest heavy-hitter theologians, if you will, like such as Origen, Didymus the Blind, Athanasius. For those who know a little bit about church history, Athanasius would go on to be one of the all-stars of the Council of Nicaea, defending the Orthodox conception of Christology. Right? When he comes out of that Alexandrian catechetical school, right? The earliest centuries, in addition to that, were marked with a wealth of writings from the church fathers and theologians as they grappled with how to best conceptualize and articulate sound doctrine while at the same time silencing the church critics. Right? And even by the 2nd century, we find the first apologists like Justin Martyr and Tertullian coming on the scene, putting pen to paper, responding to philosophers and pagan naysayers. Right? Now, this writing tradition becomes a pillar of doctrinal development throughout church history. And as we'll see in a minute, it's also a wellspring of ideas that were instrumental in shaping the Western world. Right? Now, that's a point that I want to return to, but for now, I'd just like to take a second to emphasize the profound relationship between Christianity and education, because it didn't end with the Alexandrian Catechetical School. Slide. Still on track. For example, consider the role that the church played in the intellectual life of medieval Europe. As historian Paul Spickard notes in his book, A Global History of Christians, it is from medieval Christians that you had the emergence of the modern system of higher education. During Roman times, it wasn't unusual for individual Roman elites to seek out a tutor for their education. However, among Europeans in the Middle Ages, you begin to see groups of students receiving instruction together with a prescribed curriculum and attaining a recognized degree or certificate upon completion of that curriculum, which is essentially the same pattern that we see among universities today. These activities were facilitated in connection with local churches, particularly in some of the major trade cities throughout Europe, who revolved around training clergy and are thus often referred to as cathedral schools. Now, there are a number of reasons for the development of these cathedral schools. We won't go through all of them, just to kind of show a few. For one thing, during periods where you have this increased expansion of the power of the papacy in political matters, that expansion set the stage for a greater need for individuals who could serve as bureaucrats and administrators over church and state affairs. With that, some of the secular rulers also began to find university-educated persons of great value in managing their lands and resources and sought them out as well. In such a reign, with secular rulers, university graduates were considered to be clergy and still therefore under the authority of the church. So you have like this practical administrative need that prompts the emergence of these cathedral schools, where you have educated folks who can perform these tasks. But in addition to that, you also have a third and more contemplated reason for the church's pioneering of university-style education. By the 8th century, in Muslim-controlled regions in North Africa and the Mediterranean, there had already been a stockpiling and translating of ancient Greco-Roman literature into Arabic. Now, this allowed for the Muslim theologians, and philosophers to get a leg up on the European thinkers, which was becoming increasingly Christianized, right? The recovering of the works of Aristotle and interactions with Muslim philosophers posed challenges to the biblical worldview and therefore needed answering. And so the church took it to be of the utmost importance to create outlets of higher education and thus produce trained thinkers that respond to these intellectual challenges. I want to emphasize here that it was not seen as the Christian thing to do to shelter oneself away from intellectual challenges to the faith. It certainly wasn't. To the contrary, what we see here is Christians at these cathedral schools took the biblical worldview seriously enough to refine their thinking and face these challenges head on. It wasn't a retreat position, okay? These cathedral schools would be both the precursors and cornerstones of Europe's most historic universities. Indeed, the University of Bologna, which is regarded as the oldest continuously operating university in Europe, dating back to about the 12th century, held that the teaching of canon law, as in the rules and procedures that govern the church, to be central to their mission as an institution of higher learning. Following suit within a century, the University of Paris grew out of the Cathedral School of Notre Dame, and is actually said to have been the catalyst or blueprint, if you will, for both Oxford University and Cambridge, which followed after. Now, this same sentiment of nurturing the intellect of the Christian mind would also be echoed in various American Christian communities during the American colonial and formative years. For example, the Puritans placed a great importance on people studying the scriptures for themselves. And as a natural outworking of this, it was an emphasis on literacy and general education among them. So it's no wonder then that you have the founding of Harvard University in 1636 and Yale in 1701 for the purposes of educating clergy. The scope of these two Puritan-founded institutions was later expanded to include educating young Puritans just in general. But likewise, in 1746, during the Great Awakening, you have Presbyterians establishing the Law College, which would come to be known as Princeton. Brown University was founded by the Baptists in 1760. Rutgers University, formerly known as Queens College, founded in 1764 by the Dutch Reformed community. Columbia, founded in 1766, and Dartmouth, founded by Congregations in 1769. It is no understatement to say, then, that the Western world owes a tremendous debt to the church for establishing education outlets, particularly in the West. Slide. Point number 2. You guys say, we're good. It's like that pizza sinking in, but that's all right. Point number 2. All right. The church was instrumental in the translating and preservation of many of the most important written works of antiquity. Now, I previously mentioned Greco-Roman works being translated and preserved in the Muslim world and in Europe in the Middle Ages. And I want to go back to that for a moment and kind of highlight the importance of the church's role there. Now, the Middle Ages is interchangeably referred to as the Dark Ages by some, as many characterize that period as an era of overall decline for civilization. And it's often alleged that this decline is to be laid at the feet of the church for stifling intellectual pursuits through dogma and spiritualism. However, an important point that I think is often lost on people making this sort of assertion is that it was actually the church that was a faithful custodian, if you will, of pre-Christian intellectual heritage from the Greco-Roman world, and had it not been for Christians, much of that heritage may be lost to us today. In Europe, monasteries and cathedral schools that we mentioned a second ago were among the very few places that one could find ancient texts from Greco-Roman philosophers and thinkers like Aristotle, Plato, and so on. They became outposts, if you will, for copying texts that were being recovered from the East. Specific examples of Christians on the front lines of translating and preserving these pre-Christian texts would be Catholic priest Marsilio Ficino, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, but it's pretty close. In his translation of Plato, and Lorenzo Valius translating of Thucydides and Herodotus, or Basilia Bessarion, translation of Aristotle's Metaphysics. All those works translated within the 15th century, just alone. Interestingly enough, as I was preparing for this presentation, I stumbled across Hunayn ibn Ishaq, also known as Johanneshius, which is an unfamiliar name to me. But I've got a background in medicine. I went to school. I originally wanted to be an ER surgeon. I was into that show ER back in the day. Y'all remember the tall black doctor? Like, he was just cool, man. And so I was like I want to be like that guy. And so, however, Biology 151 swiftly convinced me that wasn't the path that I was meant for. I barely made it out of there with my life. So it has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. I'm just going for it. But anyway, so Hunayn ibn Ishaq. Ishaq was an Arabic Christian born in Mesopotamia who was known to have been an expert in translating Greek texts into Syriac and Arabic. Right? Among his many accomplishments was his translating of a 2nd century physician by the name of Dr. Galen. Now, Dr. Galen's writings are among the oldest and some of the most valuable documents pertaining to the study of the human eye. Right? Galen's analysis of the eye in terms of the anatomy and proposed theories of how it worked was to some extent the gold standard of ophthalmology from the 2nd century all the way up to about the 17th century AD. It's a long time. It was Ishaq who translated the majority of Dr. Galen's writings from Greek and Arabic, and then later translators converted them from Arabic to Latin, which is the form in which Galen's theories of the eye were able to greatly influence Western medicine. Had it not been for Ishaq, this weighty contribution to the field of ophthalmology would likely have been lost. The point here is that whether it be text-related philosophy, history, math, and medicine, it can certainly be said that one of the church's greatest gifts to the modern world has been the translation and preservation of some of the most valuable literary works from the ancient world. Slide. Point number 3. Our understanding of the concept of personhood was largely framed by theological reflection among Christians. Now, what is a person? That may seem like a strange question, for some people, but it's actually a matter of deep philosophical inquiry, as a matter of fact, that's captured the attention of great thinkers for centuries. How one answers that question can have some serious implications in terms of ethics, human rights, or to make it more plain, like the abortion debate, things along those lines. It's an important question that people have attempted to answer. I don't know if I could really give a solid answer right at the top of my head, but maybe some of my more philosophically inclined folks out there could knock that out. But nevertheless, what many people don't know is that when it comes to the modern concept of what a person is, if you rewind the tape and just kind of go back through all that's been written, you'll find yourself encountering the writings of a North African theologian by the name of Tertullian and his works defending the doctrine of the Trinity. As a matter of fact, Tertullian is credited with being the first person to use that term Trinity. It comes from the Latin word trinitas. Slide. The orthodox concept of the Trinity is that God is one being in three persons. The original Latin version of Tertullian's Against Praxeas is worded una substantia tre persona, right? Can anybody say that 3 times fast? Anybody want to give it a shot? Right? I'll give you $100 if you can do it. But for ages, the Trinity has been a difficult idea for many to wrap their minds around, right? The New Testament writers use very Jewish categories and terms to communicate exactly how Jesus and the Holy Spirit were to be understood in relation to the Father, right? As Tertullian wrestled how to articulate these things to the people of his day, which is a largely non-Jewish audience, he called upon the terminology that had been used in Greek theater and Roman law. Lying behind the Latin word persona in Tertullian's writings is the Greek word prosopon. Initially, this word prosopon simply meant role or mask, but over time it came to have more weight to it. The Greeks came to use it in reference to a sort of personification of an idea or event that was being acted out on a stage. So you'd have one actor and he would be portraying different ideas, so he would kind of switch around his mask or do something physically to indicate that he was playing a different role. Also, being a Roman lawyer by trade, Tertullian employs the Latin legal term persona, which was used in a very limited sense to identify a legal entity, particularly in a very superficial way, but just kind of identify a person in a legal sense. It's kind of hard to describe here, but maybe we'll get back to the question and answer. Tertullian then takes that notion of prosopon along with persona and kind of squashes them together and makes like a word sandwich and applies them in his theology on the Godhead. Right? Now, as it turned out, Tertullian's work on the Trinity yielded not only a model of the Godhead that would inform later theologians and be crystallized in the Nicene Creed, but at the same time, Tertullian also broke new ground in introducing the concept of personhood in a deeper sense that reflects how we tend to understand it today. Later theologians like Boethius in the 5th century, Richard of St. Victor, Thomas Aquinas, and Duns Scotus will continue down that road of exploring the notion of personhood within the context of understanding the Trinity. In particular, Boethius' definition of a person as a substance with a rational nature was especially influential, but not merely in theology, in the realm of theology, rather. Through the cathedral schools and Christian-influenced universities that we discussed earlier, it's easy to see how these theologically based ideas of personhood were able to bleed out into other areas of scholarship like law and political theory. Right? Now, if we imagine the field of philosophy as being like a written conversation among various people from different worldviews across generations, it would be fair to say that when it comes to the philosophy of personhood, Christian theologians are among the earliest and most influential voices in that conversation. Slide. As the then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger put it, the concept of person, as well as the idea that stands behind this concept, is a product of Christian theology. In other words, it grew in the first place out of the interplay between human thought and the data of Christian faith, and so entered intellectual history. The concept of the person is thus one of the contributions to human thought made possible and provided by the Christian faith. There we go, slide. Number 4, the notion of keeping religion and government separate, by which religious liberties are preserved in America, is largely a result of Christian theology. The first few centuries of church history is marked with rashes of persecution endured by believers. During some periods, Christians lived in relative peace, as they were viewed as merely social outcasts. But of course, as we know, at its worst, Rome subjected Christians to forced imprisonment, slavery, cruel forms of execution, whether it be burnings at the stake or being fed to wild animals at colosseums. However, in the 4th century, a somewhat enigmatic emperor named Constantine begins to permanently change all that. In the writings of Eusebius, who's hailed as being the first church historian, we are told that Constantine claimed to have received a vision from the Christian God in which he saw a cross and heard a voice from heaven saying, "In this sign you shall conquer." Historians argue that this was the point of his supposed conversion, and you kind of disagree on whether he was sincere or not. But nevertheless, Constantine's rise to power would usher in a fundamental shift in the nature of the relationship between the church and the Roman government. In 313 AD, Constantine issues the Edict of Milan and establishes a measure of religious protection in the empire, which effectively ends the persecution of Christians in Rome. A little over a decade later, in 325 AD, Constantine would convene the Council of Nicaea, at which the bishops and clergy from all over Rome gathered together to resolve a theological debate, which at the time threatened to split the church, which Constantine believed to be a stabilizing force in his new Rome. Now, in terms of the dynamic between the church and Rome, Constantine brought peace with complications. Now that Christians were no longer public enemy number one and didn't have to hide in the shadows, and were even brought into the fold, so to speak, of Roman authority, the question became, what is this relationship supposed to look like? How do these foes become friends? Slide. In the late 4th century, St. Augustine of North Africa, born into this world of newly found peace between the church and the Roman government. Augustine comes to be a foremost authority, a prolific writer in the church in terms of Christian doctrine, philosophy, and practice. And what many would consider to be his magnum opus, if you will, titled The City of God, Augustine seeks to answer the question of how the church should stand in relation to the Roman government and the world more broadly. A chief concern of Augustine is establishing a boundary between the church and the world such that the faith and practice of the church is not compromised under the authority of the secular government, and assuring the Roman government that the church is not a threat to power, because obviously Romans didn't like that. So it's probably a good idea if you don't want to get yourself massacred, you probably don't want to present yourself as a threat to the empire. Now again, St. Augustine accomplishes this task through his work, The City of God, in which the moral of the story is that the church and government constitute parallel entities in the earth, with the church having authority in matters that pertain to eternity and the soul, while secular government reigns supreme in earthly affairs. Not quite a generation later, Pope Gelasius I echoed and refined St. Augustine's position in an epistle that he wrote to the Roman emperor of his time, entitled Duo Sunt, in which he reinforces the notion that the church is appointed by God and stands independent from worldly authorities as it attends to matters of salvation, while the government is equally God-ordained in governing human affairs. Now, these ideas expressed by Augustine and Pope Gelasius will become widely adopted in the Western world as fundamental building blocks, rippling throughout political theory as Europe and the Western world was built. Especially in America, we've been beneficiaries of this principle of separation of church and state. I think, actually, interesting enough, I think that the phrase separation of church and state is probably one of the most misunderstood ideas in America's legal history, if you will. People treat it as if it's like some type of precept within the Constitution that means, okay, therefore all you religious people shut up and stay out of our business, stay out of politics, I should say, in the public square. But in fact, that's not actually the case. That's actually a mistaken perspective. The phrase itself isn't found in the Constitution at all. It's actually contained in a letter written by Thomas Jefferson to a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, in which he's assuring them that they won't be subjected to the same violations of their religious liberties, as they had been in the old country. And so in his letter, he refers to the raising of a wall of separation between church and state, and he's actually alluding to the First Amendment, in which it talks about how Congress shall make no law to establish a religion or inhibit the free practice thereof. So taking all that together, the clauses in the Constitution that protect our right to religious liberty are an expression of the principles that were laid out by St. Augustine and Pope Gelasius centuries before, flowing from the biblical worldview. All right. Slide. We sliding on. Y'all still good?
Yeah.
We good? All right, cool. All right. Rocking and rolling. I haven't passed out yet, so that's a good thing. I tell you, I tell people all the time, man, it's like a total sidebar. The key to public speaking is to smile a lot. You know what I'm saying? When I'm really, really nervous, I just like smile even heavier because people can't tell that you're nervous. It's a little trick of the trade there, That's nice. Inside joke, fist bump. All right, cool. Point number 5. Christian thinkers put forth ideas from which international law developed. Now, what I hope for is that the audience would glean from this presentation that there are a number of things present in our everyday lives that we take for granted, and the church played a role in bringing those things to the world. Now, consider some of the things that we see going on in the world today on an international level, right? When you turn on the evening news, we see nations interacting with other nations on various levels, whether it be economically, wars, treaties, and trade, and so forth. Of course, like recently, for example, we saw this peace treaty, between North Korea and South Korea, right? And all these interactions, there are laws and expectations as to how things should go. Now, how did this come about? How is it that this community of nations have come to relate to one another in this sort of a way? Slide. Well, once again, let's turn to Europe for a second. Going back to the Middle Ages, you have the nation states of Europe essentially jockeying for a position of dominance and establishing boundaries for their territories. Breakouts of violence during this period were pretty persistent as they were trying to figure it out. It's kind of like the growing pains of Europe, if you will, right? Now, as nations were developing and asserting themselves throughout this period, you also had this gradual decline of the authority of the Pope that he had over these nation states, and monarchs were becoming less inclined to heed the advisement of the church in resolving civil matters. And so with the papacy holding less weight in international relations, thinkers began looking elsewhere for a stabilizing force among these nations. Right? To meet this need, a number of Christians were on the front lines of steering the community of nations toward what would grow to be international law as we see it among nations today. Slide. Oh, I might skip the slide. That's all right. For example, Francisco de Vitoria, a Dominican priest and professor of theology in the early 1500s, had a passion for upholding the dignity and of the newly encountered Native Americans, and thus wrote 2 works entitled De Indis Noviter Inventus. Maybe my Latin folks, I don't know if I pronounced that right or not, but hey, we'll roll with it. And De Jure Belli, in which he defended the idea of a community of nations in which included the entirety of the human race and not just those within Christendom alone. Francisco de Vitoria enumerated a number of principles that would guide members of the national community. Among them was the notion that no nation should intervene in the affairs of another nation in such a way that the global community would be negatively impacted. Reaching back to the ideas that we find in the writings of Augustine, de Vitoria further suggests that wars are not justified if they are waged solely for the glory of a ruler, expansion of territory, or over religious differences. During his time, these ideas became widespread and were actually taken under consideration a great deal among the royal councils. So these would be like the nobles who were advising the kings, and particularly in England and France. So his ideas held a great deal of sway. With that being said, among some of these nations, he wasn't necessarily popular because he's pretty much telling folks, well, you can't just do what you want to do. You can't just go steal somebody's land because of the fun of it. So his ideas were in some ways, he was vilified rather in some ways in some portions of Europe that didn't want to comply with that. But among the most famous of the Dutch reformers in his time, a guy named Hugo Grotius, took these ideas up and maintained that it wasn't enough to establish this international law on mere natural law, but rather the authority of the New Testament and its precepts ought to be the foundation upon which these nations related to one another. In the 17th and 18th centuries, men like Emre Cruz, William Penn, and a friend of William Penn by the name of John Belders took it a step further, and they articulated the idea that nations ought to send representatives from each monarch to participate in an assembly of nations, which would work to resolve differences that might otherwise result in conflict. And from this, you have the rudiments of like the League of Nations and the United Nations as we see it today. So again, we have an example of the church's intellectual heritage intersecting with how the world we live in operates today. All right, slide. Science, the final frontier. Christians were at the forefront of ushering in the age of modern science. Now, it's become popular in some circles, particularly among many of these new atheists, to declare the death of God on account of this or that scientific discovery and the misguided presumption that Christianity and science are like oil and water, right? Sadly, this idea has been prematurely adopted not only by those who oppose Christianity, but even some folks who are in the church. But is this really the case? Is it really the case that Christianity and science are incompatible? Well, I would say certainly not, obviously. As a matter of fact, the world of modern science owes it to a number of Christians for laying groundwork for this area of scientific discovery. Slide. I'd like to briefly highlight a giant in the history of science, Sir Francis Bacon of the late 16th century. Now, I'm sure most of us, or at least some of us, if we think back to our 7th and 8th grade science class, we might recall hearing about the scientific method, right? Am I alone in that? You can kind of remember some of that? Anybody? Okay, 2 people. 3, there. All right, cool. I'm not alone. Broadly speaking, the scientific method refers to the disciplined and meticulous process by which scientists go about making observations of nature, i.e. experimenting, recording what they observe, evaluating those observations, and then drawing reliable conclusions about what those observations reveal about the world. This model of disciplined methodology by which scientists do their work has everything to do with the vast increase in human knowledge that has come about through the scientific enterprise. Let's return to Sir Francis Bacon for a second. Believe it or not, Bacon held it to be a matter of fulfillment of end-time prophecy that science would be the bearer of knowledge to the world. You see, Bacon took the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 4, very seriously when it says that in the time of the end, men will roam to and fro and knowledge will increase. Bacon took note of the things going on in the world around him and associated the men going to and fro, part of that verse, to men like Magellan and others who were making voyages overseas and reporting of lands that had been unknown to Europe previous to his time. Bacon believed that these voyagers were fulfilling that first part of Daniel 12, verse 4. And that scientists would fulfill the part about the increase of knowledge and thus hasten the end times and return of Christ. So, one of Bacon's chief contributions toward that end was to propose a set of principles providing a framework as to how science ought to go about doing their work. We find Bacon's methodology most developed in his work Novum Organum, in which he stresses the importance of rigorous experimentation and observation from which scientists can increase the likelihood of their findings yielding accurate information about the world and the natural principles that govern it. Now, others would come along and build on and refine Bacon's approach, but it's safe to say that from Francis Bacon's eschatology and methodology, the scientific method became a fixture in man's quest for knowledge. Now, there are many other Christians who made profound contributions toward furthering our understanding of the world through the sciences as well. I mean, actually, I feel somewhat guilty that we can't spend time discussing Sir Isaac Newton, for example, the genius of mathematics and physics who discovered the law of gravity and drafted equations that describe motion among the planets and stars that are accurate enough to land a man on the moon today. He also wrote what some consider to be the greatest work on mathematics of all time, his Principia Mathematica. This same Isaac Newton, at the end of Principia, affirmed that the reason for his work was to draw people's attention to the wonder of God. Or we could talk about Johannes Kepler, who was instrumental in freeing the field of astronomy from certain philosophical assumptions which prevented astronomers from properly understanding the movements of planets and stars. Kepler broke away from less evidential methods of his predecessors and applied an approach to science that was more akin to Francis Bacon's, namely a commitment to accurate observations and limiting assumptions as much as possible. Kepler is noted to have said, the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order which has been imposed on it by God and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. He described his work as thinking God's thoughts after him. And a little closer to home, American botanist by the name of George Washington Carver shared some of those same sentiments. Carver was actually born into slavery toward the end of the Civil War, and at a very young age he showed a affinity and a passion for working with plants and animals. such that by the time he entered young adulthood, neighbors would actually seek him out for advice in farming and agriculture. Carver would eventually work his way toward receiving a formal education. He graduated with a bachelor's degree from Iowa State Agricultural University, which is now just Iowa State University. Now, one of Carver's chief motivations in his work was finding ways to help Southern farmers better take care of their crops. Now, many have heard the term King Cotton, which originated in America's South, as it was unquestionably the South's most lucrative export. Right, the demand for cotton made it a must-have for Southern farmers, a must-have crop that was sure to be rewarded. However, by the time of the Civil War, actually directly following, moving into the 20th century, they were entering into a cotton crisis. Years of taxing the soil with cotton crops had depleted the nutrients necessary for yielding a decent harvest. This was a crisis that posed a serious threat to the Southern economy, which was already gasping for air following the Civil War. So then along comes George Washington Carver. Carver took note of the depleted soil and went about educating Southern farmers on ways to combat it. He proposed that farmers would alternate plots of land that they farmed on, and also alternate the types of crops that they were growing, so they could let the land rest and then thus produce more substantial crops. Carver had an affinity for working with the peanut and sold Southern farmers on the idea as to how easy it was to plant peanuts and then reap a product from it. As Carver's ideas gained traction in the South, farmers began to see great profits from peanut harvest and improved cotton crops growing up from the fields that were now rested and replenished in terms of nutrients. In many ways, Carver's ideas revolutionized Southern farming practices and saved the Southern economy. Now, when asked about how he went about doing his work as a botanist, Carver explained that his daily practice was to get up early in the morning and go to prayer, where he received his assignment for the day from God. So again, you have Christians involving themselves in the world of the sciences that impacted our lives in very real ways, economically, but then also in other advancements as well. Now, I think I'm kind of running up on my time here, so I want to make sure that I don't go over a little bit. So I might have to speed up this last point. Let me end up with a story. Earlier, Nick was talking about in ancient Rome, the attitude that the Romans had towards the traditional gods. Christianity comes onto the scene in I don't know if you call it rapid paganism. That sounds kind of harsh, but their pagan beliefs infiltrated every aspect of their lives. Everything from the marketplace to civil duties. Paganism was a part of it, right? And so you have these Christians come along saying with this pesky doctrine that Jesus is Lord and we can't worship anybody else but Him. And that didn't sit too well. That didn't sit too well with the Romans, right? Particularly in the 3rd century, you have a plague that breaks out, a vicious plague that said that thousands of people would die in one day, right? And at the time, the narrative among the unchristian Romans was that it's the Christians' fault. Well, they would just worship these Roman gods and we'd be all right. The gods that protect us and the Caesars that have gone on and become godlike, they'll look out for us if these Christians would just sacrifice and everything would be okay. All right. So as this plague is raging through Europe, there's a lot of pressure. And one of the ways that you see the church responding was through acts of compassion. Right. Now, when you think about the teaching of Jesus, obviously one of the most iconic parables, if you will, is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Everybody kind of knows that story, where Jesus is talking about love, and then you have the Jewish lawyer come and say, well, who is my neighbor? Interestingly enough, actually, and now as I'm saying, I've got to think back to Nick Peters' presentation about the honor and the shame. I guess that was one of those challenges that you're referring to. Very interesting. I hadn't even thought about that. But so he challenges Jesus, says, well, who is my neighbor? And then Jesus tells a story about the Good Samaritan, and at the end of the story, he then asks, well, who was a neighbor to the man who was found beaten alongside the road? So you see, he kind of reversed the question. He was asked, well, who is my neighbor? And then Jesus says, well, who have you made yourself a neighbor to? That's the issue. Who have you made yourself a neighbor to? And so taking this ethic of compassion Fast forwarding again to the 3rd century, as Christians are facing all this criticism and pressure to bow themselves to Roman gods for the sake of the empire, so to speak, you have a guy named Bishop Sidgwick. He was a North African bishop, and under his leadership, Christians began to care for the sick, even at the expense of their own lives. They would care for the sick, and they would bury the dead, and so on and so forth. And this act of compassion, as the plague subsided, actually silenced the critics, and you find actually the growth of the church, particularly in North Africa, as a result of that. Now I'm speeding up a little bit here to say, but when you look throughout Christian history, you find that same pattern. According to historian Kenneth Scott Latourette, in his book on Christian history, he notes that there's really no other force in human history that's been responsible for the more hospitals being built and education centers and so forth than Christianity. It's never been a selfish faith. Now, with that being said, I want to go back to my previous point. This is not something where I'm not trying to make a case for Christian triumphalism as if we've got it all right all the time. But I think what we can do is look at our history and see how when we've allowed God and His Word to shine through in our lives, He can use crooked sticks to draw straight lines. And the question becomes, what does that mean for your life? What does that mean for your life? Are we living lives that are conducive, to shine the light of Christ? Or are we becoming a stumbling block for folks? How are we conducting ourselves in our workplace? When it's time to, get to work and you punch in and you read the Bible and apologetics and listen to podcasts for 4 hours on end when you're supposed to be working. I mean, that's not a good look. I know, because I've done it before. So, it's not a good move. It's not a good move. What are we doing in our communities? So with that said, I think I may be right up on my time, so I want to go ahead and end out there. But if anybody has any questions, we can open it up for that as well.
Word, man. There it is. So y'all know how we do, man. Tru-ID. Always try to keep y'all up to date on what I'm out there doing. Anytime I go out of town and present somewhere, if I can get the audio, I'll try to bring it back here to the listeners of the podcast, man. So this one was a very interesting presentation because I stepped outside of the specifically urban apologetics realm that I typically deal in, which is cool, man. I like to tell people, I mean, I didn't set out to be the quote, the black apologist, so to speak. There's a lot of things that I'm interested in and I can dip into different areas. So it was pretty cool to be able to showcase that a little bit. I did get some interesting questions though, during the Q&A sessions throughout the weekend. And what I probably do is I got the video from it, so I'll probably chop it up and throw it on my YouTube channel. So definitely check me out on YouTube as well. And yeah, man, so with that being said, if you haven't done so already, definitely subscribe to us on iTunes. Leave a comment, give us 5 stars, let other people know what we're doing. And also, man, be on the lookout for my Patreon account. I got one starting up that I'll be launching here pretty soon. We got a lot of things that we want to do here at Tru-ID, including to update our equipment, as well as get some things going to expand the ministry a little bit. We want to branch out beyond just doing the podcast, so we're looking to implement some things, and definitely want you guys to be a part of that, man. So as always, I love you guys, and it's another show in the books. Peace.